Okay, I'm going to make a very, very brief remark and then hand the podium over to our Master of Ceremonies today, Tim from Texas Monthly. But welcome to the Baker Institute. I'm Ken Medlock. I'm the director of the Center for Energy Studies here. Very, very happy to partner with Texas Monthly and Direct Energy on bringing this event to you, and glad you all came. I know this morning is a very busy morning. We've got an interesting competing show going on in Washington today, so
exactly this morning.
But with that, hopefully we'll keep you interested and entertained, and we definitely encourage questions as they come to you. Tim?
Thank you, Ken, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. Let me reiterate what Ken said. We're at Texas Monthly. We're delighted to be partnering with Direct Energy and with the Baker Institute. So thank you, and thanks to Rice University for hosting this. Let's be clear. Jim Comey, he's competing with us this morning. Okay. This is the headline event. I'll just briefly introduce the panelists, and we'll get right to this. The hope and the wish here is that this is a conversation, that it's meaningful and it's not fluffy, that we actually get right to the meat of what we're here to discuss. And the panelists, when we had a little pre-call about this, really want this to go right to the audience after they do their remarks, so that if you have questions, be ready for them, because that's really what we want the core of this to be. Okay, you guys met Dr. Ken Medlock. He's the James A. Baker and Susan G. Baker Fellow in Energy and Resource Economics here at the Baker Institute. He's also the Senior Director of the Center for Energy Studies. Ken, thank you. Jim Steffes here to my right. He is the Executive Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Direct Energy. Jim, thanks.
Thank you.
And Pat Wood in the middle. Pat is the principal at Wood 3 Partners. So these guys know a lot about energy. They know a lot about this issue. And I'm going to turn it right on over here to Jim to preview a short film for you guys.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you, Tim. Just a couple of comments before we turn on to a video. I want to thank Texas Monthly and, of course, the Rice Baker Institute, Ken, for hosting this discussion, for everyone coming today, both live and on webcast. Earlier this year, Texas celebrated 15 years of its efforts to create a competitive retail electricity market, what I believe is the most advanced electricity market in the world. This moment offers us an opportunity to recognize how Texas boldly transformed a heavily regulated industry, one struggling to meet the needs of consumers, into a competitive powerhouse, giving families and businesses the choice to choose. I want to thank specifically the hard work of Peter Hartley and Ken Medlock with the Baker Institute. Due to their analytical efforts, we have a substantial and important study which provides real proof that the competitive market is working for consumers here in Texas. From my perspective, their study did what no other study I know of did. It economically validated the market is creating robust competitive outcomes. It reviewed the full time period of the market being open, not just picking and choosing a few years. And it looked across both competitive and closed areas of Texas to understand what's really going on in this evolving industry. Before Ken comes up to discuss the study, I'd like to show you a short video, 4-minute video, which discusses the journey our leaders, our political leaders took, our industry leaders took to get us to this point. This video is really a chance to celebrate the 15th anniversary of electricity competition in the state of Texas and to honor the leaders who took brave action and helped make it possible. Almost 20 years ago, the Texas State Legislature passed Senate Bill 7. Not many people believed we would be here where we are today. But a number of forward-thinking Texans embraced the new model, and we're enjoying the benefits of their hard work. Thanks to strategic legislative crafting and hours and more hours of detailed rulemaking, Texas enjoys the benefits of the most competitive electricity market in the world. More jobs, economic growth, and a cleaner, smarter future. A special thanks to those who are here with today, specifically Pat Wood, who's been involved and right in the ring from the beginning of this conversation. I also want to thank Z-Prime. They're the organizers of the Energy Thought Summit, who created the documentary film, the short film we're going to see, Choice to Choose. After the video's over, Ken, you're going to come up and really walk us through the study, and we look forward to the conversation. Thanks, and please enjoy the show.
I can't think of a seminal piece of legislation that has had more impact on the people of our state than what y'all did.
Billions of dollars of savings
big.
to the people of the state of Texas.
Compliments to the craft and the vision of Steve Wollins and David Sibley and Pat Wood.
We had gone through a lot of deregulation, and we saw trucking deregulated, we saw banks deregulated, we saw the phones deregulated, we saw the airlines deregulated, and now we were coming to electricity.
In 1995, George W. Bush interviewed me with his boots on his table. He said, Pat, we can promise better prices and we'll most likely get better technological innovation. But the bigger issue is that they, the utilities, care more about what we, pointing to the House and the Senate themselves, think than what the customers think. And that's wrong, and you're going to change it.
There are all these new emerging technologies, renewable energy and energy efficiency, that were trying to come into the market, but the utilities were blocking the evolution of the electric utility industry.
Senate Bill 7 restructured the electric market in Texas.
People were starting to like the idea of shopping around for an electric provider, much like they did for a telecommunications provider. It was sort of a perfect storm for significant economic and social change, and that's what SB 7 became.
As an economist, I would like to have all privately owned firms competing with as much competition as possible.
Whereas if you have a market that is heavily regulated, consumer choice is heavily limited. And all of that ultimately comes back to the bottom line, and that's actually what it means for household budgets.
So a lot of money was put in to educate people how to go about teaching them to switch on their own and to move from one competitive provider to another competitive provider that would give them what they wanted.
They have the choice to choose.
Yep.
I always had in my heart that this was going to work
This was really going to become a national model.
and help inform consumers, because if we didn't have an education process, I think people would have been, no pun intended, but in the dark.
The big surprising success was the enormous renewable energy boom. While I initially opposed competition because I wasn't really sure it was going to reduce costs, I was wrong. It's worked. Not only have we attained significant emission reductions, but we've also seen significant reduction in air pollution.
Texas, in general, it's been viewed as pretty successful. And in a lot of ways, a model for other regions to consider when looking at moving forward with liberalization efforts.
I've been around the world because other countries have wanted to know how we've done this. We just put the Texas spirit behind it, so we were going to make it happen.
All right, so what I'm going to do now is provide a little bit of additional data support, if you will, for the facts and figures you just saw, particularly at the end of the short clip. We looked at, with a specific aim of trying to understand how successful market reform in Texas has been. We looked at what's been going on with residential rates in this study. We also, and I'll show you a little bit of the data that we've collected, we've also been collecting data from large commercial users in the state of Texas. This data is collected under confidentiality. We get very specific data, so site-specific data on load and billing, which enables us to evaluate for different commercial customers how rates compare across different market areas within the state of Texas and how they've actually been evolving over time. And that latter point is a really important point when you're thinking about evaluating the success of market reform. In particular, it's a little bit misleading to just look at simple averages across time because when you move from one market structure to another, the transition's equally important. So you have to evaluate what's been going on through time, which means you have to understand the dynamics of price adjustment. And so that's the other thing we did, both at the residential and commercial levels. The commercial aspect of the work we're doing is still ongoing, so I'll just show you some preliminary data that we've collected, but it is interesting because some of the things that we're seeing in the data we're collecting are things that have been noted in previous literature about what market reform might bring across different consuming sectors in an economy. It's always interesting when you're looking at data to see economic theory hold up. It sort of validates a lot of what you've been doing your whole life, but it is nonetheless interesting, and it's always important to test those hypotheses. So I guess this is working. So what was our motivation? I'm not going to read all the words on the slide. I'll just skip to the bottom point, right? What did the introduction of competition mean for consumers in Texas? We started with data that we collected from the Public Utility Commission, and this is noisy. It's hard to understand what you're looking at, but we did this on a monthly basis. Now, it's very important to point out that when you're evaluating this data, you're looking at average residential bills for a particular customer class. So 500 kilowatt hour customer class, 1,000 kilowatt hour customer class. What you see here is the data for the 1,000 kilowatt hour customer class. There are, particularly in the competitive areas, which are difficult to see here, but I'll show you annual data, which sort of smooth things out a little bit, but on the next slide. But the competitive areas, there's a lot of heterogeneity with regard to the rates that customers actually pay, either because customers haven't, use the power to choose yet, or their choice to choose, or you just have different electricity service providers offering different rates at different points in time throughout history. But if I take that same data and put an annual lens on it, you begin to see some interesting things in the data. And this actually comes out in the econometric analysis that we did, where we actually evaluated whether or not this data fit the model that a competitive market would predict. And what you actually see is that in the competitive market areas, it fits it very well. So that, again, goes back to the point I mentioned earlier that in terms of what economic theory would predict, it's predicting exactly what you're seeing. In the non-competitive areas, so in the electricity co-ops, in the investor-owned utility areas, in the municipally-owned utility areas, the results are highly mixed. Among those non-competitive areas, the ones that are closest to the competitive model are the electricity cooperatives. There are reasons why you can hypothesize this might be true, one of which, quite frankly, may be because their market areas are sometimes distributed and they're competing directly with for customers in the same areas that competitive providers are competing. So that means there can be spillover effects as a result of competition being introduced in a marketplace. But what you see with the solid lines at the top are the retail prices to residential consumers, the 1,000 kilowatt hour customer class. Going back to 2002, you see the rise there in the middle. That very much tracks wholesale prices, which you see at the bottom, the long dashed lines at the bottom. Those are wholesale prices across regions in Texas. And this actually raises a really important point. When you're looking at what's happening at the wholesale level, it's important to understand what the generating unit at the margin is. In Texas, that's natural gas. So when you see natural gas prices rise, you'll typically see wholesale prices rise along with them. Now, in the competitive areas, wholesale prices and retail prices track each other very well. This is exactly what you would predict to happen in a competitive environment, because retail electricity service providers are absorbing as a cost the cost of wholesale electricity because they're buying and then reselling. In the non-competitive areas, you don't see that tracking as well, which begs the question, what's going on? The one thing that we can certainly say is that you don't see competition driving the same sort of cost minimizing behavior that you see in the competitive areas when you think of the non-competitive areas. Now, where do we see that most evident? Well, when you get to about 2008, you start to see the wholesale rate come down. Lockstep with that, residential pricing is also falling. Now, what's interesting about this is when you look from 2008 forward, what you actually see is that the residential rate in competitive market areas actually fell faster or more than the wholesale rate, which indicates that competitive pressures are actually exerting some or imposing some efficiency and cost reduction measures in the market. So think about it this way, plain and simple. If I'm an electricity service provider and I'm competing for market share, I am incentivized to actually find ways to cut costs aside from the things I can't control. What's one of the things I can't control? Well, the wholesale price of electricity. What's another thing I can't control? Well, labor costs, right? So I have to take those things as given because I've got to pay labor, I've got to pay for the power that I provide, and then the only thing I can do is think about ways to actually capture margin by cutting costs on all the other dimensions. And we actually see that in the data. When we did the econometric analysis, you see that very clearly. You can see it when you just look at some summary statistics for each of the utility areas. And I want to draw your attention to the first column, which is the sample average across time for each one of these areas. And this is what I meant earlier when I said you can't just look at sample averages. Because if I just average from 2002 to 2016 the monthly rates, that's what you see, without accounting for the fact that in some non-competitive areas, so Austin Energy is a good example, in some non-competitive areas you actually see highly seasonal pricing to residential customers. So when load goes up in the summer, rates go up as well. Now, we don't have data for load by household, so these are simple averages, but in point of fact, if you did a weighted average, you would actually see these numbers a little bit higher. And that's actually something that you can tease out of the data by accounting for seasonality when you're doing the statistical analysis. So looking at simple averages, you see that the competitive areas appear to be more expensive, right? That's pretty straightforward. However, when you look at the standard deviation, you actually see that there's much more volatility, but that volatility is highly reflective of what's going on in the wholesale market. So again, that's an indicator that wholesale prices transmit very cleanly to retail pricing in competitive areas. And then when you look at the 2002 average and the 2016 average, so what's happened over the 15 years that we're talking about here? Well, you actually see that the starting point matters. So when you look at the initial point, so when competition was actually formally introduced back in 2002, you actually see that in the competitive areas, rates were higher to begin with. That can be the result of a number of factors that have nothing to do with competitive or non-competitive pressures. Could have to do with transmission constraints, with the cost of transmitting power from point A to point B. Lots of things get rolled into that. But when you move to 2016, you actually see that across the board for the non-competitive areas, rates are higher. In the competitive areas, rates are lower. So they've moved in opposite directions. What's really interesting about this is when you compare these to movements in wholesale rates, you actually see the competitive rates are lower in terms of being, they're lower relative to the wholesale rates than they were when we started. So again, that points to what I was saying a minute ago about competitive pressures imposing some cost efficiencies in the marketplace. Now, the study is actually being released today, so you'll be able to find it online. We wanted to sort of have this event and talk about it, and then I encourage you to look at it because there's actually a very detailed statistical analysis that was done to expose a lot of this stuff. Real quickly, on the commercial side, one of the things that we actually see is that commercial customers in competitive areas are actually paying less than commercial customers in non-competitive areas. And importantly, and this is why gathering this data in in the manner that we've been gathering it, so through non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality agreements with various large commercial users, you can actually compare homogeneous customer groups. So I can compare one large commercial user across the state of Texas in different market areas, and that's valuable because you're talking about a homogeneous customer. Right? So you can actually see what's the difference across market areas, and you actually see the differences can be quite astounding. Now, there's been a lot of literature on what the impact of market reform would mean for different customer classes, and some literature actually pointed out that there was evidence in the traditional regulated, vertically integrated monopoly type model that commercial and industrial customers, particularly commercial customers, would cross-subsidize residential customers. And we actually see this in the data. So the only way to actually verify this, because again, this is anecdotal, you see evidence of it, would be to actually collect load-specific data for residential customers in both utility and non-utility areas. In the state of Texas, unfortunately, that's just not available. So what you have to do is look at the next best piece of evidence, which is the effective rate that each of these customers are paying, and you actually see that the relative rates are indicative of exactly what we're talking about when we talk about cross-subsidization in the non-competitive areas. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because if I'm a commercial user, and this again gets back to the dynamics of price adjustment over time. If I'm a commercial user and I am in a non-competitive area and I feel that the regulatory burden is relatively high on me in this particular location, if I have options to go off the grid, so install rooftop solar, do other things, particularly as costs of those alternative energies come down, then what that means is I will be migrated off of the load serving entity's rate base. So at the end of the day, the utility still has to cover its costs. And so what you do is you run the risk through cross-subsidization of alienating those that are cross-subsidizing other customer units and ultimately having to raise rates on the customer group that you were trying to cross-subsidize because the rate base is disappearing in the other venue. So it's not a sustainable policy. Interestingly, and here at the Baker Institute, I've got some colleagues that are doing a lot of work on the sustainability of subsidies, particularly in the Middle East, where if you're tracking the news, you know that there's a lot of subsidy reform on petroleum products and electricity there because of the unsustainability of demand growth and the inability to cover costs. Well, that model applies no matter where you are. So when you start thinking about the long term and what you might actually see in these non-competitive areas, it becomes we'll just put it this way, it raises a lot of questions. And that's actually an area where we hope to do some further exploration because I think there's a lot of interesting questions that can be asked related to that particular issue. So key findings, I've basically said all these. I'm not going to reread them, but you'll see two things in quotes. First, again, as I said before, sample averages can be misleading. The dynamics through time matter. And then there's all the points that I've already mentioned with regard to the trend in pricing, prices at the beginning of the time period and where we are today, and then repeated for emphasis, right? Sample averages don't tell the whole story. So it's important anytime you're evaluating market reform, and this goes beyond the state of Texas, this model can be applied anywhere, quite frankly, that you actually look at the dynamics of price adjustment post-reform and try to understand how various measures may have been introduced as reform was being instituted. That might have actually had an impact on price dynamics. So in the state of Texas, an example of this is the price to beat mechanism that was instituted at the beginning of market reforms and then later moved away from. So these things actually there are, in the data, we see statistically significant evidence that they did matter for pricing as we moved through time. So it's important to control for those sorts of regulatory reform measures. So I'll stop with that and I think hand it over to Pat.
Thanks, Ken. One of the things after Bush gave me the job, he told me get busy. So for 6 years we executed on the vision that the little film put out there. And one of the lessons that is tough for a Texan to learn is humility. But the one we learned really emanated from that wise motto that said pioneers get shot, but settlers get the land. It's okay to be number 2. And so we spent some time talking to the pioneers of electricity around the world, particularly Pennsylvania, California, the UK. I didn't get to make that trip. Sorry, Karen. It would have been fun to be there. Australia. I didn't do that one either. Or Chile. Nobody went to Chile. We just studied it from afar. Uh-oh. Something happened here. Well, I think we'll worry about that in a little while. It was important to learn from markets that work, and in case of California markets that didn't work so well, what we wanted to do. So I have to say here that we are like a good car with a lot of parts from all over the world. We designed it based on what other people had done. So Texans can be humble, and humble leads to a better outcome, I think. I'm pleased to have read an earlier draft of Ken's study and look forward to seeing the final. I understand it's just formatting, but there are a lot of good things in there. We talked about price. I'll mention something about that when I close, but one of the mentions that it had was on the environmental benefits of a diverse generation fleet. And in light of recent activities regarding the climate change treaty and what have you, I wanted to posit that there is a lot of hope out there regardless of what happens in the national capitals. There are 2 models for cleaning up our power sector. Model A, which I would call the top-down government policy-driven model that is represented by the Clean Power Plan by the state of California. Model B, which is the bottoms-up customer choice-driven plan, which is what we have had here for the last 15 years. And so when I look at a 3-part report card, just trying to keep it simple, on penetration, innovation, and cost, I would give Model A, the California model, a medium on penetration. They've had good solar and decent wind, but not like ours. Model B, Texas, wind, way off the map, high penetration of renewables, solar right behind it. Innovation, I'd give Model A high. California spent a lot of money to get a lot of innovation, and it delivered. Model B, Texas, we didn't spend any money on it, and we benefited because it's good to be that settler. But on price is your real differential. Price in California, very high. 16.2 cents all in for all customer classes average, last month's S&L report. Model B, Texas, the average price here is 7.21 for all customer classes in last month's report. I have a lot more faith in the customers of this red state to drive change that benefits our climate than I do policymakers in Washington, Brussels, Sacramento, or any other out-of-touch location. As this paper thoughtfully points out and Ken walked through, it's the combination of effective, I would say, as the chairman of Dynegy, ruthless wholesale price competition and an efficient retail market structure working together to deliver this kind of value to customers. And while in the opening years of the market prices were going up, Ken observes that the important role of the underlying natural gas price has been to go downward really since 2007 when the market completely deregulated. As it went downward, the reflection of that in the prices that we pay in Texas and in other North American markets. Once fracking effects have hit, I like to tell my kids it's a green slope turned to a double black diamond. We really had a lot of benefits from having an efficient market structure to deliver that all the way to the end-use customer. As a regulator, I got to confess, there's no way that I don't have low self-esteem. It's not, hopefully, after 10 years as regulator, it's not that high either, but there's no way that 3 appointed or 5 appointed or held 20 appointed or elected people can substitute for a market in a way that delivers value for customers. We did it 100 years ago as a fight back to Sam Insel and the big monopolists. That world is gone, and the oversight regime that was set up for it needs to evolve as well. But it's not just about the fuel input price. As chairman of the major power generator Dynegy, I do pine for that return on equity that those wonderful regulators give to the regulated entities, usually 15% plus on equity pre-tax. We are happy to get a quarter of that. Now, I should add that our plants run far more efficiently. It's funny how that happens when you're not spending other people's money anymore. The third big pot of savings, besides fuel price and the return being compressed, is from not paying for unused capacity. Now, I had actually thought that the extra 15 to 18% that we used to order the utilities to have on hand would have been burned away by now by the competitive market, but it's not. It still sits out there. In fact, the latest forecast shows that it's 18+% for the rest of this decade and beyond. I fully expect that to be whittled down. Like, you can't keep that much idle plant on and not get paid for it for that many years. But we have private investors here in this state, Calpine, NRG, Dynegy, others that are bearing that risk. And I consider this shift of generation investment risk, which is a big bunch of dollars, folks, as you know, the shifting of this risk away from a captive customer who sits there for 30 years and pays for an old nuclear power plant like the poor souls in Georgia get to do for the Vogtle plant, or the poor souls in Mississippi get to do for a Kemper experiment that costs $7.9 billion in clean coal. Shifting away from a captive customer to those in the market who are paid to manage it better. That is the greatest single benefit of this enterprise that we engaged in. It took a confluence of a good plan and a whole lot of good fortune to achieve the retail market structure that we have that consistently passed that savings on. And as I mentioned, we borrowed heavily from others, particularly in this case, Pennsylvania, who did a wonderful transition from having the utility in the driver's seat to a more competitive market. I think we took it to probably the best extreme when we said that the incumbent utility, the wires regulated company, gets out of retail business altogether. In our city, we have CenterPoint. In Dallas, it's Encore. AEP is in other parts of the state. Those entities really, their job is to deliver electricity, not to worry about selling it, making money on this or that. They deliver electricity, and that separation of function has benefited us quite well. I do want to make one observation and then sit down on the price discussion in the paper. In a competitive market, it's really difficult to ascertain the average retail rate. And so when I was reading, and I think it was the last chart here that Ken had, I've raised issues with the PUC commissioners who have done this tracking for 15 years that, you know, they track the original retailers and they track the original retailers' original plans. Well, no market is static, and this market particularly so. And so the plans that the PUCT tracks that form the basis of our data is among the highest being offered to customers today. But we have, had to draw from a consistent set of data over these 15 years to reflect the study, and I think that PUC really is the only set we have. So in reading that, I went online last night just to check out for myself here in Houston, and my sister lives in Dallas, so you have to know a zip code to get into the Power to Choose website. So if you make one up and you're off by a digit, you get a little ugly message. But I looked for the 1,000 kilowatt hour, 1 year, no gimmick contract price, which is kind of considered to be the standard. Although the month I could use 1,000, I'm going to be sweating and it'll be awful. But mine's a bit higher than that. And I wish I could get that 10-cent rate when I lived in Austin. I would never see that one, I'll tell you that. But I went last night to the no contract, the no gimmicks, which means no little hidden credits that appear and disappear at random times. 1 year contract in Dallas, from the cheapest to the most expensive, 123 plans. I had to go all the way up to 105 to hit the 9.3 cent rate shown in the study. In Houston, for the same 1,000 kilowatt hour plans, there were 126 of those, so we beat Dallas by 3. That's always good. I had to go all the way up to offer number 106 until I hit the 10.2 cent rate. So 105 offers were less than the 10.2 cent rate. Standard offers available on the internet. You don't have to know the secret handshake or have a relative that works for the company. And so when we did the last regulated case here in Houston, unbundling the rates in the year 2000, natural gas was sub 250. And the power rate was 10.1 cents or so, 10.08 or something cents per kilowatt hour. 17 years later, inflation, et cetera, gas is about $1 higher. But in last month's bill, my provider told me the average price I paid for electricity this month was 6.9 cents. So that was a 2-year all renewable offer, no gimmick, that I signed for up in last year sometime online. So I have a history of reverting to animal metaphors. The public transcripts of the PUCT and FERC are rife with these. and I won't disappoint today. My label for anyone in Houston paying a residential electric rate anything north of about 9 cents is a dumbass. So get out there and shop. It's easy. It takes 15 minutes. powertochoose.org and powertochoose.com. They both get you to the same place. Giving it back to you, Tim.
Well done, Pat. I think I know there's no dumbasses in here. So we're in a safe space. Okay, we're going to go to questions and just a couple housekeeping things here. When you raise your hand, please identify yourself and your affiliation. And if you're directing your question to someone specifically, please say so. And remember, we're looking for questions, not speeches. So, just saying that. And then if you're Twitter inclined or social media inclined, we're using the hashtag BakerEnergy. Okay, yes, sir.
Bob Longoria. Sun to Socket is the company. My question concerns infrastructure. And the infrastructure wasn't spoken to in any of the presentations or in any of the economic analysis. I think that's the elephant in the room. I think Texas has an old infrastructure by and large, with CREZ being the exception, but they're handling the wind, as you know. What is, or whose responsibility, rather, is it for infrastructure and the transmission lines to be maintained? Because all of this is happy talk without the infrastructure.
So the question, in case you didn't hear it, was about...
That's for Pat.
Okay, Pat. Whose responsibility is the infrastructure?
Hi, Bob. I think the central lesson I learned from the California energy crisis that I had to go put the fires out of when I went with Bush to FERC was, if you don't have infrastructure, the rest of this is a charade. Without robust infrastructure, competitive markets, or really you can't make it work without that and the oversight. Infrastructure remains what it has been for 100 years here, regulated. And so we've got CenterPoint, Encore, AEP,
TNMP.
TNMP are the main four here inside ERCOT. There are some vertically integrated ones outside the ERCOT boundaries of Texas. That continues. The state did require or mandate, or I would say strongly encourage the implementation of smart meters to really enable both the reliability for the distributor of power, but also the customer. I don't think that that's been optimized at all. It's starting, but most people are bypassing that and doing their own devices in the house, which is fine. The infrastructure on the big scale, CREZ was a huge one. CREZ is a competitive renewable energy zones where about $7 billion of your dollars was spent to expand the grid all the way up into the panhandle to bring in low-cost energy from wind, mostly. There's some gas up there and probably solar to come. That beefed up a lot of the grid inside the central part of the state as well. I think that will continue, probably not in that grand of a way, but you'll continue to see the grid expanded and replaced. The bigger issue is, are we going to be a big grid kind of world or not? I was testifying in Nevada on retail competition, which is the state that in the Trump-Clinton election was the kind of headline I was looking for, was what did Nevada voters, they voted 72% to move to a market structure like the one we have here. Maybe not exactly like the one we have here. Solar is cheap. I got on the board of SunPower in 2005, $5 per watt. We lost the bid last month because we bid 35 cents per watt. It's come down that much. You think about it in a big field, in a community, on a rooftop, it's huge. And I didn't appreciate that. And I'm on the board of a company that should. I didn't appreciate how big that is. That's going to have significant infrastructure implications for anybody in a sunny state. Now, we're probably not as sunny in Houston as they are in Austin, but I would say from here west, it's going to be a humongous game changer.
I mean, the only thing I'm done. The infrastructure piece. The other piece of this is that the market itself is what I call one of the big trends is digitization of this marketplace, and it's both happening at the meter. In Texas is clearly at the forefront. So in terms of that infrastructure, I think we have over 9 million smart meters in Texas. But check that data. And that's starting to be used in ways which truly does transform the retail conversation with customers. It goes well beyond having a price, an average price, because that average price, even those average prices, start to show things that don't come up. My company, for instance, provides what we consider to be the bill of the future. We can disaggregate your large appliance usage in your home by just understanding the 15-minute data that comes off those smart meters, and then applying that with some of our own technology and understanding. today. That's starting to have a conversation that we've never had before. We're empowering consumers. So I think before we think about infrastructure, which is to me the old way, let's go build more plant because you might as well put more concrete in, might as well string more lines. Why don't we first have a conversation where consumers really understand the value and what they're getting and why they're using energy, the amount of efficiency that's out there. We have a product today. Yeah.
If you don't get the electricity because of congestion in the old lines, it doesn't make any difference what the snapshot of the market is today.
Yeah. We're getting the electricity, but it's a good point. I think Texas has a great regime that allows for the infrastructure players to come in and build when they need to build. But we also have an ability to make sure we're not wasting energy in a way that nobody else can do.
Yes, sir, right here.
I want to sort of tie into that with the penetration of renewables, Texas is the biggest wind generator. You spoke about increased penetration by solar. There comes then, in our California is the vanguard, I suppose, of this, is what you do when the sun is shining and storage then becomes an issue. What's being done about that? Where do you see that going? Energy storage, both and across the spectrum.
Question is about energy storage, rise of solar, and how do you?
Dan, I think a quick answer is it's the same ski slope that wind and solar have already gone down. Solar storage is next. Smart people, smart money, smart technology has all shifted from the first two to the third, and I think it's just a matter of time. It'll be challenging. I'd love to see something like compressed air, just because my natural gas background, I love the idea of Ks, but whatever. I mean, I would have never dreamed this up 20 years ago, so I'm not going to dream up the storage. But I think storage is a silver bullet that we're looking for to make all that work.
I guess to follow up on the question, how does that affect the transmission? How would that fit in from a regulatory point of view? That how do people get paid for storing power, et cetera, et cetera?
I've been in the middle of that one, and I think the best answer is what we did with natural gas when I was at FERC as a staff guy. You recognize that there are some attributes of storage that should be put in the regulated rate, but the rest is competitive. And probably the easiest thing to do in Texas would be to separately tariff it as a regulated entity, but separate it out from the wires rate that everybody has to pay. Or keep it totally competitive. If nobody wants any rate recovery at all, it's out there just like a generator. If you want some rate recovery, it's tariffed. And that's probably the last thing the regulators need to really be doing. I mean, the only thing remaining that they will do is to exercise vigilance over that boundary, because it's tough. You've got an asset that has competitive and non-competitive attributes to it. It's impossible to let them stand alone in either. You can't justify it as a full regulated investment, and it's hard to make it stand alone as a pure competitive. I think that'll all change when you get the pricing down, like the way solar's gone down. It'll just be, everybody will be out there, it'll be everywhere.
So I'll add one thing to that. So, because we've got some people here that are looking at the implications of storage on electricity markets. And one of the interesting things that comes out of the work they've been doing, just using existing costs, not thinking about what's going to happen as storage becomes more mainstream. And I agree with Pat. I think costs will come down dramatically. But it's not necessarily true that the small sort of distributed generators are the ones that benefit the most from storage, because you can think about storage in a commercial level serving large baseload facilities in a different way as well. In terms of how, when you think about cost recovery, how that actually happens, I actually agree with Pat on the natural gas analog. I mean, one of the things you saw when natural gas storage moved to market-based rate making was you saw a tremendous amount of investment go into increasing the efficiency, so increasing turn rates on storage facilities, increasing the efficiency of injections, withdrawals, and lowering the cost. I mean, that's a great example of where competition did exactly the same kind of thing we're talking about. So I think at the end of the day, that's probably where we'll end up.
Yes, sir, in the back, and we'll come around this way.
Yeah, thank you. Neil Golightly at Shell Oil. Both you, Pat, and the film drew the correlation between the penetration of clean energy and this deregulation trend. I'm not quite sure I understand the cause and effect there. Was it a consumer pull? Was it the inherent economic competitiveness of renewables? Was it the $7 billion in wires out of West Texas? What is the connection between deregulation and clean energy?
I would say primarily Neil would be the first. I think consumer pull. And I think, I'm pretty right of center for those of you that know me, but I like it. It's geeky and fun and it's local. And so there's a lot of attributes of renewables that I happen to like. I think there are a lot of people in Texas, even more so businesses, who are feeling the kind of investor pressure for some sort of accountability to the climate issues or greenness, or just even people that, school districts, military bases, big box retailers, manufacturers, chemical companies, gated communities, small communities, municipal governments. A lot of people there. That's a pretty big net. You add all those up, you get to 30% pretty fast. You might even get to 50. So I don't know if the consumer pool gets you to 100, but it certainly gets you from where we were, which was basically 0, to what we've got today. Cost, yes, has gotten better. There were no mandates here. You got federal tax credits, so you got carrots, financial carrots. That affected costs, obviously. But I do think the consumer pull has been, I think the marketing has been C- at best. There's a hell of a lot more that people could do to market it and make people understand that you really are paying for these credits. I mean, you're not getting that windmill in your backyard, but it's pretty darn close. Financially, it's the same thing. And so we'll get there.
I think the other thing about that, I mean, we do that, sure, and competitors in the room have, green companies, and I think, but the element you're talking about, what competitive markets allow for, is this concept of designing your own energy future, right? Which Pat talks about is what do the corporates want to do, what do the small business want to do, what do homeowners want to do, and I think it did help in the early days. I think it will only accelerate because I think consumers everywhere we turn, no matter who we're talking to, they're asking those questions. Forget about policymakers from on top making choices. They're going to design a future much faster towards cleaner, smarter energy than we can ever imagine. And they're doing that now with us. And they're forcing us to be, which to Ken's point, I mean, every day we have to compete a little bit harder because they're asking us to do a little bit more. Even places like Virginia, we're now able to offer a green tariff, and we're getting huge amounts of interest from customers, both big and small, to express that preference outside of the utility, the regulated utility.
Right here.
Yeah, Bernard Slagardo, just individual at large, no affiliation with anybody.
Individual at large. That's nice.
Smart guy.
I just wanted to talk about the effectiveness of price signals for new construction in a competitive market. Are they effective, given that we've got in some cases you've got some pretty large investments with volatile prices and long duration for recovery of your investment?
Questions about price signals.
You want to jump in? I'll follow you up.
Like I said in my remarks, Bernard, I would have thought that the overhang of excess capacity would have burned off by now in Texas, and it has not. And so the price signal in both ways. So there's not a price signal right now at all with the prices that are being given, $24 a megawatt hour. We had a little excursion up to $400 for at least 15 minutes yesterday in Houston, but that's not enough to drive what you would consider a decent investment in even a small gas-fired plant. So we're not getting price signals today in this market, but we shouldn't with the 18% overbuild. If some plants close down or retire or mothball or don't work anymore, that'll change. But I think that story's yet to be told.
I mean, one thing, if I can, again, the way we look at the market starts with the customer, starts with the consumer. Your question sort of said, what's the price signal to a generator? And we're competing across the globe and seeing businesses and homes think about energy differently. So the price signal that they're seeing on their bill and the information they're able to take away from their energy usage is providing a price signal. And this goes back to designing their future. The price signals are making them, Bryce probably thinks about this all the time, about how they're using energy, why they're using energy. That's the price signal that the industry needs to pick up. This is a consumer market. This is a customer-driven market. And it's both in the competitive places like Texas, but elsewhere. Because technology doesn't sort of is limitless. And it's going to go everywhere. And so signals are being given to customers, and customers are making choices about how to use energy differently, how to use less energy, how to use the right energy. And so when you think about that signal, just remember it's first and now really for the first time hitting consumers, and they're making better choices. That's what New York is talking about with the REV. That's what California is thinking about, but they're doing it through regulators instead of through customers. And that's what Texas is benefiting from, because we're in this, I think, a wonderful position. You see the results because we've now given consumers the chance to design their own future, and that's only going to continue to accelerate. So the prices are there. Customers are using it, and they're going to make right choices on lights, efficiency, motors, more and more and more.
Right here. Yes, ma'am.
Question for Pat. What is going to be the role for FERC, now the major natural gas company in Canadian?
Well, I always considered my relationship with the National Energy Board of Canada to be the most gratifying as a FERC chairman. So maybe that becomes even closer for the future. That's a great question. The integration of North America, though, is something we should embrace, not resist. I mean, I think, coming from a state as known for its parochialism as Texas, it's a change to go to a bigger arena in Washington and realize, hey, we're all on the same team. Why don't we work together better? I think that works with Canada and with Mexico. I wish our president would understand that as well as we all do here in Texas. But that integration with Canada, from a regulatory point of view, I think it just becomes similar to what we've had to do with the states, that FERC had to do with the states, which is balance that co-regulation. But they're robust regulators up there. It's not too dissimilar from FERC, maybe a little more hands-on in the kind of rate case world. FERC kind of moved beyond that on the gas pipeline side, at least in the last decade or so. But I think I'm not too worried about regulatory either doubling down or missed balls with Canadian headquarters for some of our gas, because the pipelines still have to come to FERC for rates and tariffs and expansions and all that anyway. It's just the headquarters move from Houston to Calgary. Not a bad thing in the summer.
Hi, my name is Tekin Kunt. I'm with SimplePowerPlan.com.
I see that on your shirt.
I want to go back to the consumer. I mean, first of all, thank you very much for setting up this infrastructure for us as consumers. This is second to none in the universe, and it's perfect. Now, me as a consumer, last year I realized that I have difficulty choosing the best plan for my case using powertochoose.org. Powertochoose.org is a great marketplace for all the plans in there, but it doesn't give me the customized information about my own usage. So that's why we created this company and service. But how do you see how you empower the consumer to make the right choices? I mean, on the average, we can talk about 9 cents and 6 cents and stuff, but there is still benefits the consumers can get without removing all these special plans coming into the marketplace.
How do you further empower consumers?
I think, I'm not sure if I clicked on y'all last night too, because I was looking to see who else, when you put Power to Choose on the Google thing, what pops up. One of the things we tried to do is create a fact sheet that looked like the label on a can of peas, and that everybody's required to do that. And that's really where I go, and I encourage people to go. Now, the PUC did a very helpful thing just this year. I wish it had been a couple years ago, to kind of eliminate the minimum credits usage. I call it the no gimmicks. I referred to that in my remarks a minute ago. The no gimmicks rate, that if you use 999 kilowatt hours, the next one you get a $60 credit. But if you go over 2001, that credit disappears. Well, that's the gimmick to look good on the Power to Choose search engine.
But with all due respect, that might be useful for a consumer.
But
it's consuming that much. And,
correct.
And you can monitor and control that.
And that would be my mother-in-law, Galveston, who got that plan. She loves her 65, and she hit 998 kilowatt hours last month and called me up in a rage. I said, leave your door open, Barbara. But you have to, one of the things, and I think this is a point, and I'm not sure if it was your website or another, but you have to know some basic information. You don't have to be a whiz kid, but you got to be bright. It's like going to shop for a car. You can't just walk in and buy a car. You got to do some research, and you got to know how much you use a month. You got to know what you're paying. You got to understand if you're using, you got to probably think about, in the winter, I'm going to be different than last month's bill, because you might have gas heat instead of electric. So you've got to know some basic things about your service, and I don't think that's a lot to ask a customer. It might be a lot to ask I think the Vermont aunt moving, was that your site? The aunt moves in from Vermont and moves into an apartment and doesn't know what the hell to do about anything. I read that last night, and I thought, oh, well, that's fair. I mean, it'd be nice if somebody were there to counsel her. So maybe simplepowerplan.com is where I tell her to go instead of...
Okay. Right here. Yes, sir.
I'm thinking about, and I'd like the panel's thoughts on the status of the ability of consumers to respond real-time to price signals and the availability of those price signals. I think it fits in a couple places with getting rid of the 18%, but also I think the economics for storage companies, as they look to the future, it's fairly obvious how they can monetize the arbitrage between prices at different times of the day. But what's not so obvious is the role they would play in the ability to reduce that 18%, and unless there is a way to monetize that through the real-time prices and demand response.
I mean, I think there's a real time, right, which is, I think, probably overused term in our industry. I used right time, right? You know, my father's in the room. I think the right time for my dad is probably once a month to get a bill. He looks, you know, and could see much more actively because there is data that would allow it. So I think if you think about the right time for consumers, but there's a lot of products today that give people access. So there are products, we don't offer them, or there are products in the market where people can literally pass through the hourly or the 15-minute prices to their bill, right, if that's what they really want. And they have the ability to control by turning their thermostat up or down and other appliances in their home. We have other products. I mean, one of our products, which is a prepaid product, we did some research recently, and it is drive people to make conscious choices around spending on energy. And the customers that are on this product and see a bill every day, you know, they're using up to 14% less energy than a postpaid customer, than the standard customer that gets their August bill in September. I mean, you know, is that real time? I don't know. I mean, again, I think it's a designed product that meets the need of each individual customer. So they can decide if it's about, I want to pay small bill amounts, or I want to not have a deposit, or I want to basically see spot prices in my price, or I want to take a 3-year fixed price and go away and forget about it. So, but those are all out there today, and there's a lot of ways to start expressing demand, and I think, again, it will continue to accelerate, where individuals who really want to see that and take advantage of the marketplace can, if they choose to do it and put in a little more work. I also see a lot of automation coming. I mean, we set up a connected home group inside of our parent company, because we really do think that you're going to now get the ability to control and with the right amount of security and privacy, but to control and give people comfort that they're going to minimize their bill while they're getting the quality of life they want to have.
Yeah, there's a theme that keeps coming up here. I don't know if anybody's connected the dots, but it gets back to something called fungibility. So we've talked about storage, we've talked about transmission, we've talked about capacity margins, we've talked about demand response. All those things do is ensure that customers can get electricity when they need it at a reasonable price. So at the end of the day, when we're talking about the role of competition and the impact of competition on marketplaces, it really is about addressing all of those things. The issue about, you know, the 18% came up. Well, one of the reasons that hasn't been compromised is because consumers are actually adopting more efficient practices. We actually see that dramatically. So that what that does is, even with economic growth, it minimizes the amount of load that you add to the system. So that can actually extend the life of a particular capacity margin. When we start thinking about smoothing out loads with storage, that's just another element of fungibility, because all you're doing is adding an arbitrage arbitrage mechanism, so ability to trade from a high demand to a low demand period, right, or a low demand to a high demand period. So all of these things are critically important, and that's actually something that you're seeing happen. And to Neil's question earlier, it's really customer driven. This is not something the regulator is driving. It's actually something that the customer base is driving, and I think you're going to continue to see that.
Right here, and then we'll come back to you. Yes, sir.
Okay, General Tsai, Center for Energy Economics. So I think this question is for Ken. So you mentioned several times that in the competitive market, the price will move closely with wholesale and then with natural gas price. Then how do you make sure that the effect that you now observed is because of competition per se, but not because of the side effect of cheap natural gas?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one of the things we did, and I encourage you to read the study because we go through the econometric analysis explicitly, but you control for wholesale prices. So we're talking about competition at the retail level. So as natural gas prices fell, wholesale prices obviously fell, and so that benefited customers at the retail end. You also control for labor costs. Data from BLS can actually get you that. But then you have to account for things that are unobservable. And so one of the ways to do that is using things like time trends that you can discretize based on different periods of regulatory reform. And what you actually see is that in the competitive market areas, you don't see this in the non-competitive areas, wholesale prices and labor costs come in highly statistically significant, which is lockstep with what a competitive market would predict to be the case. But then you also see the time trend is highly statistically significant, and it's negative, which tells you that there's an erosion of the gap between retail and wholesale prices over time, which tells you that the firms that are operating in that space are actually taking steps to minimize costs relative to wholesale and wholesale prices and labor costs. So what that tells you is that there are other things that are happening that competition is inducing because you don't see the same thing in the non-competitive areas over the exact same time period.
And as somebody who's run a competitive retailer, I know every day you have to wake up to work to do better than you did the day before. It's just the way retail markets operate.
I'm Kimberly Johnston with Ernst & Young, and I have one question directed at Ken, and you highlighted on this on your remarks, is this unsustainable path. And it goes back to customer choice, and you have industrials and ERCOT that may be partnering with energy providers like Eagle Rock. And at someday, at the end of the day, someone has to pay for the infrastructure and the resiliency of our city. So if you could highlight more about the study and where you see that going. And then the second question is to Pat. This is phenomenal, the competitive environment that we created in ERCOT on the investor-owned utilities. How do we expand this competitive market beyond ERCOT as well as for municipalities and co-ops?
So real quickly on the unsustainability. So it's not something that we can say with a tremendous amount of confidence yet because it's something we've only got a minimal amount of data to date. So like I mentioned, we've actually been collecting data under confidentiality from different large commercial users, and it allows us to compare across market areas for a single large commercial user how rates are different. So you've got a particular customer class that you sort of know, well, why do they look different here than they do here? And then what that's inevitably going to allow us to do is make some assessment about whether or not you do see clear evidence of this cross-subsidization. What we see so far is definitely consistent with it. And what's remarkable about that is we're not the first people to notice that, right? That's actually something that's been written about in the literature. It's got a long history of documentation. But when you start thinking about the longevity of this type of policy in a competitive marketplace versus a regulated marketplace, in the regulated marketplace, and this is anecdotal, but some of the conversations we've had with some of the commercial users who provided us data, they noted that they were more aggressive in installing solar panels in places where they had facilities in non-competitive areas. And you say, well, that's interesting. It was, yeah, it had a lot to do with it provides a hedge against regulatory risk. I thought that was a very interesting statement. So you think about it, you say, well, what exactly do they mean? Well, because what happens is in the bill that they're getting, it's more than just the energy commodity. They're getting billed for lots of things that have nothing to do with the actual electricity they're consuming. So rather than absorb that. They figure, well, if price of solar power keeps coming down, well, there's a cheap alternative. I'm going to go this direction. What that means ultimately is that in those particular areas, another element of the rate base is going to have to pick up that cost. And if it ultimately means that all the commercials go off the grid, well, it's going to fall to the residential customer. And so what you see in the data for commercial customers is evidence that that is definitely occurring. But to then take the step and say you see that there's real risk that residential rates are going to rise, you would need actually specific data for residential customers, test the theory, and that data is just not available. So all we can talk about is something consistent with something else, and then you just got to sit back and wait and see. So.
And then Kimberly's second part of her question, I'll answer it brief. Expand beyond ERCOT and go into munis and co-ops. Two preconditions for any expansion to be successful are, in light of our first question from Bob, was infrastructure. If we don't have robust infrastructure, don't bother. The second thing is, does marginal cost of the available power out there, is it less than the average cost of what you're paying? Which is the precondition. We had both in Texas, so we did it. Once that flipped and gas started to go up in 02, 03, even I was telling people like Arkansas, Oklahoma, stop. I would not do this. It won't be a happy ending. That's flipped now. I think with fracking from 07 forward, it should be back on the agenda, and it is. Our holy alliance here was, the governor, the industrials, and the competitors who really lined up and said this paradigm is going to change. In Nevada last month, that I saw firsthand, was the casinos, the mining companies, and the solar interests. So you've got different political alliances that really create that rolling ball of moss that becomes a boulder by the time it hits the bottom of the hill. My only regret from Senate Bill 7 is that we had to, like Sophie's Choice, leave one child behind, and that was the munis and the co-ops. That was to get the deal politically done. So the 86% solution was the one that we're all trumpeting today, but that did leave a lot of citizens behind the vertically integrated model. Now, we tried to distinguish in our minds, at least so we could sleep at night, that the city councils and the co-op boards were different than the IOU corporate board, but in the same regard, it's an elite making decisions for the many, and I regret that, but it's the way it was politically, and I think we're going to have to use the same holy alliances in these specific areas to open them up and allow everybody to have the benefits that we're all getting.
Can I make one point? Because I think we've done another study recently with the Perryman Group, and I think one of the key benefits that we don't talk enough about, we talk about the consumer benefits, the economic benefits, the innovation. There's also a big job benefit in Texas. I mean, Houston is effectively the retail advanced energy capital of the world. Dynegy, Calpine, NRG's here, Direct Energy, our North American headquarters, are here, Just Energy, NG has a big presence. This is the hub, and we in Houston, and I'm a lifelong Houstonian, we don't do enough to promote it. And the numbers show over 40,000 jobs, permanent jobs, direct and indirect, have been generated in Texas. It's, there's billions and billions of dollars of revenue being, coming through Houston. And we have an opportunity, if the rest of this country and the rest of the world moves to a competitive market, to really grow and, again, diversify our own Houston energy economy. So I just make that point. I think it's something we don't talk about enough. We sort of don't see that, but because of the choice that we made 15 years ago, or almost 20 years ago, in the market and so successful, people are coming here because it's an opportunity to grow and innovate with good, high-paying jobs. And so it's something we need to be thinking about as Houstonians.
Well, we could go on, and I think we should, if you like. But out of respect for people's time, we're going to wrap here. Please join me in thanking the panel.
Just got your report by email, so.